Dr. Richard Carrier, I have a really good fan, Anthony Guthrie, and he has a question for you.
All right.
He says, apologists often try to handle for the problem of slavery being in the Bible. How similar are the biblical principles of slavery for non-Israelites as compared to the principles of slavery in America during the transatlantic slave trade? Did American slave owners and anti-abolitionists try to use the Bible to justify that slavery should be continued because it was in line with God's will? Why would an existing omnipotent loving being choose a method of revelation that would be at least, if at the very least, be interpreted in support of such an abusive system?
Right.
Why would that God not make very clear that slavery should be outlawed when it took the time to tell us that we shouldn't wear mixed fabrics or eat shellfish?
Yeah. I mean, that's a spot-on question, of course. It's a God who actually believed in liberty and human rights and things like that would not make that mistake. It would be fundamental that you shall not own slaves. It would probably even say you should free all slaves that you can find, from your people that you conquer or whatever. It would have an actual declaration of human rights and principles of freedom. The Bible doesn't have that because they didn't believe in those things back then. And if you're going to compare it to antebellum slavery, which is probably the most brutal system of slavery ever developed by the human race, you look at the ancient context. Now, Hector Avalos wrote several books on this, so it's worth looking if you want to look into slavery and a comparison of slave systems around the Israelites at the time and the Israelite slave code and how they compare. They're pretty lined up. In fact, some of the other cultures have more enlightened slave laws than we find in the Bible. The Bible is a very simplistic, stripped-down legal system. There's much more sophisticated legal systems that it's kind of copying bits of around them, right? So I think that's probably one of the strongest and most secure moral condemnations of the Bible, and definitely guarantees that the Bible could not and was not written by any kind of God.
The fact that a book could be so easily used to promote antebellum South slavery is a huge red flag, I would think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It should be impossible, right? It should be as impossible as using the 13th and 14th Amendments, right, to justify slavery. And that's even granting the fact that the 13th Amendment actually does allow still slavery as long as you're a convicted criminal. So we still have slave trading in the U.S. today. So even our Constitution now amended is not the perfectly moral document that it could have been. But it is still far superior in its morality and in its prescience and understanding of human liberty and the need for human welfare, certain rights and principles for human welfare. You don't find this in the Bible. And I have an article on that Christian nation nonsense that I have. And then I have other articles on my blog about pagan origins of things like human rights and other aspects of like constitutional government and things of that nature. So if you want to go, and you can go check, like the Greeks and Romans came up with much more enlightened stuff. And even they were far backward compared to where we are today.
Yeah, often I hear Christians try to justify that it wasn't what we think. And maybe there's some truth to the fact that it wasn't as cruel as antebellum South slavery. But, I spoke with Dr. Joshua Bowen, and he was mentioning that there are some of the court systems in the South where they had laws, just like the Bible, where you can beat them in the inch of their life, but don't kill them, because if you kill them, it's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you took that, why is that even in the Bible? I mean, were people beating their slaves to death?
Well, yeah, of course.
So it makes me think like...
I mean, that's what happened in the antebellum South. Brutal torture and abuse was standard. And you got to remember, the Bible doesn't just endorse slavery; it endorses sex slavery as well, which was also a component of antebellum slavery, and it is the chattel form of slavery too. You often hear people say, "No, it's just indentured servitude." It's not. There's a special rule for the master race, right? So if you've got the Israelites, then they can sell themselves for limited periods, like 7 years, and then they have to be freed or whatever. But that's just for Israelites. But this is what the actual Bible says. This is Leviticus 25. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you, in other words, other non-Israelites, that you may gain acquisition, in other words, turn them into slaves, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, right? So that's antebellum slavery right there. And even like the system that we used was fundamentally racist. This is also racist in the sense that Israelites are not subject to this slave law. It has to be outsiders. But it's not color-based racism, right? So this isn't like white people are free, colored people are slaves. The antebellum system definitely was built off of the backs of the Age of Exploration, which decided we're going to raid Africa for slaves and create this system, this race-based system. And in fact, W.E.B. Du Bois said, like, before the Age of Exploration, there were no white people, meaning that the concept of whiteness as a racial identification didn't exist. You had Germans, you had Portuguese, you had Italians, you had Ethiopians. You didn't have color-based race. Did not exist. It was only the slave owners and the slavers of the Age of Exploration, when the great empires started raiding continents, mostly the continent of Africa, for slaves. Even Native Americans, when they were enslaved, it was always a color-based slave system. Even that you might have some like white people in indentured servitude in some of the colonies, that was not the system of slavery that we're talking about that was going on in parallel. It's just like the Bible. You have like, white people, you could have indentured servitude, and even that died out pretty quickly. But black people were going to be permanent slaves that you can sell and own. And the Bible has several passages in it about how you can have sex with your slaves, and you can even like take war captives, go capture someone, take a woman and turn her into a sex slave, and that's completely authorized and allowed. So much for the sexual morality of the Bible, right?
It's almost like promoting, not just that you can, but it's encouraged.
It actually is kind of like ordering you to, right? Like, it is definitely encouraged. Yeah, it is actually, and one of the incentives God is giving for them to go conquer other peoples, rather than giving them the incentive that you can go free other nations and free their slaves. No, you can go invade other nations so you can up your slave count and and have more sex with slaves. Basically, systematic rape is what we're talking about here.
And look, we know a lot of these narratives are myth, but even in the narrative, right? Like Abraham with Sarah, and Sarah says, "Go ahead, sleep with my slave," right?
Yeah.
He gets her knocked up. She gets pissed. Now the slave that's already your property, right, is getting booted, and like, her survival is like at stake at this point too. You're already just property. Now you're booted, and your son is cursed as not a chosen.
Right. Yeah.
There's blessings supposedly that come from, but it's like, yeah, you're not my firstborn. Like.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. Thrown away like trash, basically.
Yeah.
Is the idea. Right.
And this is a myth. I mean, that they promoted this narrative.
Promoting these values. Yeah. This is an immoral myth, is what you would say. Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, this is not a defensible system. And it's one of the clearest markers in the Bible that it is a human document written by primitive savages and not by civilized beings, supernatural or otherwise.
So if you can get a Christian to see the reality of what the slavery was in the Bible, what would you recommend to them?
Just read it.
Yeah. I mean, what do they do from there, right? Like, what would you think?
Well, if you really want to get into the history of it, get Hector Avalos' book, Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship. And it is a very thorough book by Hector Avalos, and it covers all kinds of aspects of this question. It is the definitive starting point for this kind of argument and debate.
Thank you.